Canada is under siege, and the numbers tell a story that's far more complex than what Prime Minister Mark Carney is saying. Prime Minister Mark Carney said 85% of the trade between Canada and the United States is tariff-free despite U.S. President Donald Trump imposing 35% tariffs on goods that aren't compliant with the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. But here's the problem. That statistic is hiding a massive gap between what could be tariff-free and what actually is.
Your ambassador, the U.S. Ambassador Hillman, I think she's characterized Canada's position right now as one that lots of countries around the world would be envious of, because the effective tariff rate for Canada right now on all goods and services going into the U.S. is about 5%. That's not a bad place for Canada to be right now.
So if I understand your answer to that question correctly, you're saying it's the energy in the room is the reason why Canada got hit and Mexico did not?
Well, Canada really, number one, Canada really didn't get hit very hard. Okay?
But still got hit, and Mexico did not.
Mexico did not, and it's, the negotiators, I'm assuming, are sitting in the room and saying, okay, we're making, the negotiations that we're in right now with Mexico and where we believe we are headed, say, we're making significant progress, and maybe the dynamics in terms of describing the relationship with Canada are slightly different. I'm not in the room, okay? So I can't tell you specifically why Canada got hit with those tariffs and Mexico did not.
But you're the ambassador to Canada, so
I am the ambassador to Canada, yes.
So why, I guess my question is, does Canada, I guess another way to sort of get at this is, did Canada, the fact that Canada has imposed retaliatory tariffs on the United States, did that play a factor in the decision? There's
a number of issues that could affect the decision that the president made.
The energy in the room between negotiators tells a different story. While Mexico received an extension on trade negotiations, Canada didn't. And though Canada's effective tariff rate on all goods and services going into the U.S. is only about 5%, the differential treatment between the two countries reveals deeper tensions. We're talking about a trade war that's reshaping North America's economic landscape, and the real story is buried in the fine print of compliance data that most people never see. So what's really happening, and why is Carney's 85% claim not telling the whole story? To understand this, we need to dive deep into the mechanics of modern trade agreements and the bureaucratic nightmare that's costing Canadian businesses billions. But 85% only roughly describes Canada's exports to the US, which have the potential to qualify for exemptions under CUSMA, not the proportion of exports that is actually spared from Trump's tariffs. This is where things get interesting. When Carney talks about 85% tariff-free trade, he's talking about potential, not reality. It's like saying 85% of students could pass a test if they showed up and took it. But that doesn't tell you how many actually did. The actual numbers are staggering. However, only about 38% of U.S. imports from Canada were traded under CUSMA provisions in 2024. Think about that for a moment.
Well, first of all, I start off every interview with saying how much we love Americans, how much we love the U.S., and as I've said on this show many times, that a tariff on Canada is a tax on the American people. And as you've seen, the study from Yale, it's going to cost Americans $2,400. Manufacturing employment in the U.S., there's over 37,000 people since April have lost their jobs. It's the lowest rate in 5 years, and it's just not working. Let's create the AmCan fortress. Two strongest countries in the world. Again, this is hurting the American people as the rest of the countries, including Canada, is diversifying our trade. We're seeing a 25% increase in trade with the European Union. The UK is up by 30%. So as we're diversifying and onshoring products, the American people are losing their jobs.
What would the impact be for Canada and for the U.S. if President Trump pulled out of that agreement?
Well, it would be unfortunate. We directly employ, just Ontario alone, 9 million Americans, and across the entire country of Canada is probably closer to 20 million Americans rely on Canada for jobs, and vice versa. We rely on jobs with trade with the U.S., but it's just hurting both countries. And as we're diversifying and the rest of the world's diversifying, onshoring products that are typically made.
Trump's tariffs are hurting both American and Canadian workers. A Yale study shows these tariffs will cost Americans $2,400 annually. 37,000 U.S. manufacturing jobs have been lost since April, the lowest rate in 5 years. Meanwhile, Canada is diversifying trade with Europe, seeing a 25% increase, and the UK with a 30% increase, as the U.S. imposes these tariffs. Less than half of Canada's exports to the U.S. were actually using the free trade agreement that was supposed to protect them. That's not a small gap, that's a chasm that Trump has driven a truck through. But why weren't Canadian companies using CUSMA protections? We believe this low percentage was largely due to the administrative burden of meeting its rules of origin requirements, when a large share of U.S. general tariff rates was already zero outside of the North American Free Trade Agreement. In other words, Canadian businesses were taking the easy route. Why fill out complex paperwork when you could trade tariff-free anyway under most favored nation status? That comfortable arrangement just got blown up. U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order Thursday to increase a tariff on Canadian goods to 35%, effective Friday. Prime Minister Mark Carney released a statement just past midnight on Friday after U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order to increase a tariff on Canadian goods to 35%. Trump's justification? Trump announced the increase on Thursday, saying, Canada has failed to cooperate in curbing the ongoing flood of fentanyl and other illicit drugs, and it has retaliated against the United States for the president's actions to address this unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. But here's where the data gets really interesting. In his statement, Carney said Canada accounted for only 1% of fentanyl coming into the U.S., and that the country has been working intensively to further reduce these volumes. So we have a trade war that's supposedly about fentanyl, but the numbers don't support that narrative. What's really happening is a fundamental reshaping of how North American trade works, and Canadian businesses are scrambling to adapt. The compliance rush is real, and it's happening fast. U.S. tariffs were already in place for key Canadian exports in March, but the share of exports meeting CUSMA USMCA rules of origin already showed signs of increasing, rising to 50% in March from 33% in February and 40% a year ago, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. That's a massive shift in just 1 month.
Just in the last 3 months, we've seen the U.S. auto industry face $6.2 billion in tariff-related costs, with most of them projecting significantly higher costs for the year. We're looking at 37,000 manufacturing jobs that have disappeared in the U.S., and factory employment is the lowest it's been in 5 years, which is not a good thing. And you see what happens with President Trump. Someone gives them the wrong job numbers that are accurate job numbers, they get fired. Well,
The U.S. auto industry alone has faced $6.2 billion in tariff-related costs in just 3 months. 37,000 manufacturing jobs have disappeared, and factory employment is at its lowest in 5 years. Major companies like Procter and Gamble have lost $1 billion. These tariffs on Canada are essentially a tax on Americans. Companies that had been avoiding CUSMA paperwork for years suddenly found themselves racing to get certified. But here's the challenge. Meredith says applying for CUSMA exemptions can be a daunting process for small businesses. The complexity is staggering. There's no simple list of items that are CUSMA compliant because products are certified on a case-by-case basis, based on a number of complicated factors. In order to get the exemption, a certain amount of the product needs to be made in Canada with Canadian inputs. Let's break down what this actually means for businesses. The manufacturer would have to make sure that enough of the materials come from Canada, Mexico, or the US. That amount is usually about 60%, according to lawyer Daniel Keiselbach, a managing partner at Miller Thomson LLP. Sounds simple enough, right? Wrong. Electronics and machinery, in particular, are product types that tend to have a harder time getting CUSMA certification. On top of that, the certification process can be challenging. requiring records showing where all a product's components come from, and it is costly. This is where Tyler Meredith's analysis becomes crucial. Citing that percentage alone understates the costs Canadian businesses are facing as Trump imposes more tariffs, argues Tyler Meredith, founding partner of the policy-based public affairs firm Meredith Bosanquet and Phillips. Meredith, who served as an economic advisor to the Trudeau government, understands the broader implications. "We are one of the most trade-dependent on the United States of any developed country," said Meredith, a former economic advisor to the Trudeau government. "If the consequence is that trade overall falls, as we are seeing now in the data, that's going to be a cost that we disproportionately bear relative to other countries." But here's where the story gets really interesting. Despite all the challenges, Canadian businesses are adapting faster than anyone expected. The Bank of Canada said in its monetary policy report released Wednesday that an estimated 95% of stuff sent south of the border qualifies under that agreement. That means the new, higher 35% rate will be felt by a small fraction of exports that are not CUSMA compliant, which likely includes a broad array of products across all sectors, according to experts. That's a remarkable turnaround from the 38% compliance rate we saw in 2024. Canadian businesses, when faced with existential tariff threats, found ways to meet CUSMA requirements that they had been avoiding for years. But this rapid compliance comes with costs that go beyond paperwork. But he said that faced with higher tariffs, they may be considering either taking on the costs of certification or looking at markets beyond the US. This is exactly what Trump may have wanted, forcing Canadian businesses to either pay more to trade with the US or look elsewhere. Carney's response has been notably measured. While the Canadian government is disappointed by this action, we remain committed to CUSMA, which is the world's second largest free trade agreement by trading volume. The U.S. application of CUSMA means that the U.S. average tariff rate on Canadian goods remains one of its lowest for all of its trading partners. That's diplomatic language for "we're not panicking," and the data suggests they might be right not to panic, at least not yet. From data reported by the U.S. Census Bureau, the average U.S. tariff rate on imports from Canada rose to 2.3% versus a 7% rate on average globally, as exporters appear to have been largely able to comply with rules of origin under the CUSMA Free Trade Agreement. So while Trump is imposing 35% tariffs on non-compliant goods, the overall tariff rate Canada faces is still relatively low because most goods are now compliant. It's a classic example of how headline numbers can be misleading, but there are sectors getting hammered. Other sectors of our economy, including lumber, steel, aluminum, and automobiles, are, however, heavily impacted by U.S. duties and tariffs. For such sectors, the Canadian government will act to protect Canadian jobs, invest in our industrial competitiveness, buy Canadian, and diversify our export markets. The steel and aluminum sector is particularly vulnerable. The standard 50% Section 232 duties remain on Canadian steel and aluminum. These aren't CUSMA-related tariffs. They're separate trade measures that hit regardless of compliance status.
Pleine croissance et de nouveaux partenaires commerciaux fiables à travers le monde. The first pillar is to give our companies that need liquidity, that liquidity in order to address immediate pressures. To do so, we'll provide up to $700 million in loan guarantees. This will ensure that forestry companies of all sizes have the competitive financing they need to maintain and restructure, if necessary, their operations during a period of profound transformation. Second, to make the softwood lumber industry more competitive for the long term, we will provide an additional $500 million, largely in grants and contributions to supercharge new product development and new market diversification. Products such as reinforced timber and low-carbon wood fiber-based insulation materials that are used in prefabricated and modular housing. These investments will increase domestic processing and value added, particularly as technology changes the way we build. This new funding will include initiatives to support Indigenous-led forestry business development and diversification, something that Gorman has stood behind for decades. Third,
The government has announced comprehensive support measures, including $700 million in loan guarantees and $500 million in grants for product development and market diversification. The focus is on pivoting from U.S. dependence to growing Canadian markets and reliable trading partners worldwide. Carney's strategy appears to be playing the long game. Rather than retaliating tit for tat, he's focusing on what Canada can control. Prime Minister Mark Carney showed no signs of retaliating against U.S. President Donald Trump's increased tariffs, and even suggested he's open to removing existing tariffs if it would help Canadian industries. We look at what we can do for our industry that's most effective. In some cases, that will be to remove tariffs. The Prime Minister said his government will look at opportunities to do so because in the end, we're looking at having the best impact in Canada. That's a sophisticated approach. Instead of escalating the trade war, Carney is essentially saying, we'll remove our own tariffs if it helps Canadian businesses. It's economic jujitsu, using Trump's aggression against him. The broader context here is crucial. Mr. Ford, speaking to reporters Wednesday after a virtual meeting with Prime Minister Mark Carney and his fellow premiers, said he believes Mr. Trump wants an early renegotiation of the United States-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, often referred to in Canada as CUSMA. He added that he doesn't believe Mr. Trump will wait until next year to renegotiate the free trade agreement as scheduled. Ontario Premier Doug Ford is warning that this tariff drama might just be the opening salvo in a broader renegotiation of CUSMA itself. He could pull the carpet out from underneath us on CUSMA tomorrow with one signature, so let's be prepared. I think it'll be coming in November, in my opinion, Mr. Ford said. If Ford is right, then all of this CUSMA compliance scrambling might be temporary anyway.
Is at 10.
Okay, pardon me, UK at 10.
Yeah, below 10, I think would be very, very tough.
So no matter what, are tariffs, I guess another question is, are tariffs just here to stay?
From the
American
Donald Trump
perspective.
the answer is yes. I think the president has made it clear that we will have a new trade regime where there will be tariffs for every single country in the world.
In response to this, we've talked a little bit about, the reaction from the Canadian public. Some Canadians are choosing to boycott American products. Some Canadians are choosing to change their vacation plans. Some are even going so far as to selling their vacation properties because they're frustrated in this moment. Do you think that's sustainable?
That is for the Canadians to decide. What I will point out is that Americans are continuing to move forward. We still consider Canadians and Canada a strong friend. Americans are still vacationing here. We have not banned American products. We don't have, consumer-driven, buy American and stop buying Canadian. Those are things that Americans have not done. We get along, we believe we get along great with Canada. If the Canadians want to make this more of a personal anti-American perspective, that is their business, okay? But I was just out in Vancouver and went to one of the tourist areas.
President Trump has revealed his vision for a new global trade regime with tariffs for every country. The UK has a 10% base tariff rate, and it would be very, very tough for any country to get below 10%. Tariffs are here to stay as part of Trump's strategy to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. and secure American prosperity. Trump could be using tariffs as leverage for a broader renegotiation of the entire trade agreement. But here's what's really fascinating about this whole situation: the speed of business adaptation. The share jumped to 50% in March as the CUSMA, USMCA compliance become more critical, and we expect will continue to rise relatively quickly in the months ahead. By our count, more than 94% of Canadian exports to the U.S. are likely compliant with CUSMA rules of origin. That suggests that the administrative burden wasn't insurmountable. It was just inconvenient when there were easier alternatives. Once those alternatives disappeared, Canadian businesses proved they could adapt quickly. This has implications far beyond Canada-U.S. trade. What we're seeing is a real-time experiment in how modern supply chains respond to sudden regulatory changes. The answer appears to be faster than most economists predicted. Carney's 85% claim, while technically accurate about potential CUSMA coverage, was misleading about actual compliance rates. But the rapid shift toward compliance suggests that his confidence might have been justified, just for different reasons than he initially stated. The real test will come in the coming months. Canada has so far held off on any retaliatory action since the imposition of the higher tariffs, with Mr. Carney, as well as his senior cabinet ministers, repeatedly pointing to the Free Trade Pact when asked whether new measures are being considered. That restraint might be paying off. By not escalating, Canada is forcing Trump to justify increasingly aggressive tariffs against a trading partner that's demonstrating compliance with existing agreements. It's a calculated bet that Trump's tariff threats are more about negotiating leverage than genuine trade policy. But there are real costs to this strategy. An earlier version of this story reported that the Canadian Steel Producers Association says there has been a 20% drop in steel production since tariffs were imposed. The association, in fact, reported a 30% drop. That's not a statistical error. That's a 30% collapse in a major Canadian industry. While most Canadian exports might be shielded by CUSMA compliance, the sectors that aren't protected are getting devastated. The broader strategic question is whether Carney's approach of emphasizing CUSMA compliance and avoiding retaliation will work in the long term. While there's no way that Canada can characterize what happened as a win, there's plenty of evidence that it's not a reason for Prime Minister Mark Carney's government to panic and do something that jeopardizes what really matters for the Canadian economy: tariff-free access to the U.S. That analysis from experts suggests Carney's strategy might be working. By not panicking and not retaliating in ways that could jeopardize CUSMA itself, Canada is preserving what matters most: access to the U.S. market for the vast majority of Canadian exports. But the political pressure is building. Mark Carney has been Prime Minister for over 140 days, and still the tariffs are there and rising, Poilievre said. We know President Trump is somebody that nobody can control, but that's why it was wrong for Mark Carney to promise that he could do so. Poilievre said that since Carney has been in office, it has been elbows down and tariffs up. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is hammering Carney for failing to get Trump to back down. But that criticism might miss the point. The question isn't whether Carney can control Trump. Clearly, no one can. The question is whether Canada can maintain its economic relationship with the U.S. while Trump uses tariffs as a negotiating tool. The early evidence suggests Canada is succeeding at that more limited goal. CUSMA is the one thing that is ensuring normalcy in trade flows in much of the economy, said Eric Miller, president and CEO of Rideau Potomac Strategy Group. And so the maintenance of that exemption was absolutely crucial. That's the real victory here. While headlines focus on 35% tariffs, the reality is that CUSMA is still functioning and protecting the vast majority of Canadian exports. It's not the trade war that many feared, it's a more targeted pressure campaign that Canada appears to be managing effectively. The ultimate test will be what happens when CUSMA comes up for review. We are also very cognizant that in about 9 months from now, the first review of USMCA, CUSMA as we call it, will begin between the three parties. So there's a bigger picture there, he said. That review could make all of these tariff battles irrelevant if Trump decides to renegotiate the entire agreement. But by demonstrating that Canada can comply with CUSMA requirements and by avoiding escalatory retaliation, Carney might be positioning Canada for that larger negotiation. The story of Canada's trade relationship with the U.S. under Trump is still being written. But the early chapters suggest that while Trump's tariff threats are real and painful for specific sectors, they haven't fundamentally disrupted the broader trading relationship. Canadian businesses have proven more adaptable than many expected, and the Canadian government has shown more strategic patience than critics demanded. Whether that approach will work in the long term depends on factors beyond Canada's control. But for now, Carney's bet that CUSMA compliance and strategic restraint would preserve the relationship appears to be paying off, even if his 85% claim was more aspirational than accurate when he first made it. The real lesson here might be about the resilience of modern trading relationships. Despite all the political drama and headline-grabbing tariff announcements, the fundamental economic incentives that created CUSMA in the first place are still operating. Canadian businesses want to sell to American consumers, American businesses want to buy Canadian products, and both sides have found ways to make that happen even in the face of political turbulence. That's not to minimize the real costs being paid by workers and communities in affected sectors. But it does suggest that the economic relationship between Canada and the US is more robust than the political relationship might suggest. And that might be exactly what Carney was counting on when he decided to play the long game rather than engage in tit-for-tat retaliation. Thanks for watching. If you want to see how other countries are navigating Trump's trade policies, check out our other videos. And if you want to stay updated on how these trade wars are reshaping the global economy, be sure to subscribe for more in-depth analyses and breaking news.